Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I am Chris Cornelius, the Chair of Architecture, and I am pleased to introduce the 23-24 Marjorie Mead Hooker Visiting Professor, Felecia Davis. This prestigious visiting position was established at the UNM School of Architecture and Planning to honor the memory of architect Marjorie Mead Hooker. Marjorie Mead Hooker, a pioneer in the profession of architecture, was the first woman to earn a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Texas, the third woman to earn licensure and practice in Texas, the first woman to be elected as president of AIA Albuquerque, and the first woman to serve on the New Mexico Board of Examiners of Architects. From 1951 to 1988, she practiced in several offices, including her own practice. In 1990, she received the Governor's Award for Outstanding New Mexico Women. In 2003, she received the New Mexico Architects Medal from AIA New Mexico. Felecia Davis is an associate professor at the Stuckman Center for Design Computing in the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at Pennsylvania State University and director of Soft Lab at PSU. The point of the lab is to establish a culture of hands-on making and thinking through computational materials, and the lab links together research, teaching, and practice. Davis is also a principal in her own design firm, Felecia Davis Studio. She is the founding member of the Black Reconstruction Collective, a not-for-profit 501c3 group of Black architects, scholars, and artists supporting the funding design work about the Black diaspora. She has completed a PhD in the Design and Computation group in the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT. She received the Master of Architecture from Princeton and her Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Tufts University. Davis has recently won the New York Architecture League's Emerging Voices Award in 2022, the 2022 Association for Computer-Aided Design and Architecture Innovative Research Award of Excellence, and the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum's National Design Award 2022 for Digital Design. It's my pleasure to welcome Felecia.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that introduction. And I'm very happy to be here. I have not ever been to New Mexico. There's a beautiful building here, some exciting work that I see happening, and appreciated the tours that I had this afternoon. So I'm honored to walk in the footsteps of Marjorie Mead Hooker, and I'm glad to hear more about what she did. It sounds like an amazing person. So I present my work very humbly. I am going to share with you this evening 3 projects. The first projects are works from MoMA, Reconstructions Exhibition. It's a quilt and an antenna. And the last project is on exhibition currently at the Venice Biennale and is a work in progress about hair, of all things, that shape space that one can occupy. So I think these projects will reveal some of the seams in my work that are areas of investigation. So the path that one walks as a Black architect or designer has many seams or places that one improvises and stitches together to make a story, or really understand where one is in the world and how to make sense of things that cannot, under any circumstances, make any sense, and never did. There are many gaps and lacunae that are bridged by these seams. And I have found these to be places of creativity, of productive work, and ways of imagining fragments from the past that allow one to integrate to make a new future. We can go forward here. So to give you some context, this is Soft Lab at PSU in the Stuckman Center for Design Computing. And it's inspired by my advisor's lab, who at the time was at MIT, Leah Beakley, who actually is joining us here today. And it was, when I walked into Leah's lab, it was really exciting. There were just all these colorful things all around. There were all these bits and electronic equipment. And I was just like, wow, totally turned on to what was happening. In my lab, we're really interested in engaging the rich traditions of textile craft and using them in architecture. So you'll find a computerized knitting machine, a computerized sewing machine, electronic bits, soldering stations for students, staff, and faculty at Penn State to use. And essentially, the lab is open to the university community. There are two research directions in the lab. The first direction is more architecturally traditional, where we look at textiles for sheltering. So you see on the shelves some tension structures that are these kind of tents that we're looking at. They were solar gathering tents. And these are projects like shade structures and other places where people can shelter underneath. A second direction is looking at the human body in space and trying to understand the potentials for rethinking architecture by understanding the augmented and sensing body. So these projects are things that you wear on your body or use the body as part of its system. So you might be talking about a shirt. You can just see at the tip, the last corner here of this slide, there's a body, a kind of mannequin with some clothes on it that we've been trying things on. And so those are the types of projects that go on your clothes full of sensors and basically allow the body to be in conversation in a different way with the environment. So in particular, we've worked on computational textiles, which are textiles that respond to their environment via programming, embedded sensors, and electronics, in addition to using the natural responses from fibers, where the response is used by the designer to communicate some type of information to people. So we're really looking at trying to say something through the fabric to people. So we're trying to augment the functionality or communicability of textiles. And as work in the lab has progressed, we've turned more and more to looking at biodegradable materials that can be less harmful to the environment. And I've found that working with the material itself shapes a way of thinking and working that leads to considering architecture and its practices in a different way. I would say that my lab has been working towards understanding of a soft system, which thus far to us is a system that accounts for and accommodates a technological system that can register design in relation to specific bodies. So the first project or scene that I'm going to share with you is from MoMA's Reconstruction, Blackness and Architecture in America that opened in February 2021. It was a group show that was supposed to open October of 2020, but the pandemic pushed the calendar back about 5 or 6 months. So we had some extra time to think about what we wanted to do. There were 3 curators who were responsible for the show. Sean Anderson, Associate Curator at MoMA, Mabel Wilson, a Professor of Architecture and Professor of Africana Studies at Columbia University, and Ariel John Krosnick at MoMA as a curatorial assistant, who changed really what normally happens there. I was honored to work with these three curators and appreciated how they had agreed to collaborate. It made me trust the institution more, because the museum really was not known for showing the work of Black artists. And so really their work was to build together with the artists a kind of conversation about architecture in its relationship to Black culture. So these 3 assembled an amazing advisory board of Black artists, architects, curators, urban designers who attended a second meeting where there was a conversation, a critique of work that was planned for the exhibit. So just like you students present your work, we presented beginning work to a group of curators and this other advisory board, and we sat down and we talked about them. And the first group that we met with was a group of 3 called Practicing Refusal Collective, who are Mabel Wilson in the purple shirt, who wrote Negro Building Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums. Sadia Hartman, who's sitting far, I think far right, with a black V-neck. She wrote, amongst many books, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and Tina Campt, whose new book, A Black Gaze, Artists Changing How We See, which was about to be published at the time. So we really were talking about what they were thinking about in their books and really kind of trying to flesh out the kind of main ideas of the exhibition through our work. At this first meeting, this group discussed refusing to participate in systems of oppression, which made each of us question if we should hold such an exhibition in the first place, especially in this institution, which was really all about showing its power and shaping a space about art and architecture that was not inclusive or interested in the work of people of color. And so this conversation really, after we met with them, you know, as a group of artists who had been invited to work here, we met separately and said, well, should we actually participate in this? What do we want to do? Should we refuse? And we decided that in spite of the known challenges, that we thought it was important to use MoMA as a platform. After all, they had allowed the curatorial team to formulate what we felt was a well-framed, forward-thinking exhibition and allowing us to have a conversation. So we appreciated that freedom, as well as a call and response with the curators, with the rest of the team that opened up what was happening. So as our act of refusal, the group of artists, we formed the Black Reconstruction Collective, or the BRC, at our second meeting, I think it was second or third meeting in November of 2019. And the overarching purpose of our organization is to finish the project of Black emancipation that was started in Reconstruction era of the United States, but eroded by successive structures put in place by white supremacists. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization here to provide intellectual and monetary support for artists, scholars, designers who are creating new knowledge about design for the African diaspora. So the point of the BRC was to take the work outside of the museum. So it went beyond us, individual artists and projects, into a broader realm. A second point was to produce a space where artists, designers, and others could try things or look at things that may not be looked at because of cautiousness or outright blindness. So this is a photograph of the bridge into that exhibition that we called our manifesting textile, that is the mission statement for the BRC. And it covers the name in MoMA of the Philip Johnson Gallery. And just to sort of tell you about the kind of side story, it's not really a side story, but a story that emerged as we were working, is that many of the artists that were invited felt very strongly about not putting their work up in a Philip Johnson gallery, because Philip Johnson was a Nazi sympathizer and tried to initiate a fascist group in the United States. And so we talked about this as a group, and this was our way of preparing new ground for that show. So really not taking the name down, that was the original request, but using something that we were creating to make a new space. To do this, we had several meetings with the curators, the head curators of MoMA, like Lynn Lowry, on January 6th, which you all know is infamous in the history of the United States now. And we were online on Zoom, all of us artists, with the curators, asking their permission if we could do this, as they were not interested in taking down the name of Philip Johnson. So this was a compromise, and they were all very excited about this and agreed and were interested in doing this. So this was a kind of weird juxtaposition of things happening literally at the same time we're in this meeting on Zoom with people. You know, our loved ones are calling and texting us saying, do you know what's going on at the Capitol? Have you seen it? Have you seen what's going on? You might want to check out the news. So that was happening at the same time when we were meeting with them to do this. Fiction stranger, reality stranger than fiction. So these were the 11 artists participating in the exhibition. Each artist was asked by the curators to select a city from a list that was agreed on by the curatorial team. And as I look back on it 2 years out, refusal happened in a variety of ways in the works that were shown and on exhibit here in MoMA. I saw a refusal to present anything that fixed or otherwise tried to repair historic acts manifested in the 11 cities selected. And such acts included the regular toolkit of wiping out Black communities in the US. These tools included the use of highways to cut Black and communities of color off from larger settlements, to use eminent domain to declare Black neighborhoods as in poor repair and to seize the land for other purposes, redlining, etc. So rather what I saw was a reimagining of what could be, an imagining of what was good about Blackness. And what I saw was a potential and space for making dreams. What I saw was a refusal that really was to use the space to you know, look at these problems and rather sort of springboard over that into a kind of an imaginary space to dream. So the first piece that I'd like to share with you is a quilt. My city that I selected was in Pittsburgh. I had recently moved to Pennsylvania and wanted to know more about it. So I'd done some work in Pittsburgh before with the August Wilson Center, but had not really looked into the dynamics of the Black neighborhoods there. So I chose the Hill District to begin to understand what stories were there. And I did a lot of research, some of which I'm going to show you in a video, which was made in response to the BRC's question, what is Black reparations? And it's one of a triptych of videos about stories of Pittsburgh. So there are two parts that were part of the work commissioned for me for MoMA, transmissions and receptions. So the transmissions part is a quilt that connects the Hill District in Pittsburgh, which is a historically Black neighborhood, and it tells stories about the district. It's meant to travel outside the museum, beyond the gallery. And the second part is the receptions part, and is a fabric antenna that stayed inside the museum. So to show you a video that gives you kind of short version of some of this research. So one of the things that interested me in this area was the fact that when you drive into town in Pittsburgh, you're really faced with this giant, vast, empty area that's paved over with asphalt. And there might be a few cars parked there, which is really quite shocking. And so for me, the whole exploration and historical research started with the question, what happened here? Really? And the idea of the quilt was a way to start making sense of all of this, and was not intended to be the architecture, but really rather a way of understanding a kind of heuristic device, something to think with and to think through. So the quilt is actually, what you see here is a seed quilt that was made in Soft Lab with two of my team members who, right before COVID hit, this is February 2020, and we're stitching and sewing and essentially got to recording some of the stories of what happened in each of these quilts. So the point was that you touch the copper on one of the panels and it would tell you a story. And the recordings are all me because we couldn't go out and get anybody else's story. So essentially the quilt is now, I guess you could say, a repository and a conversation starter. We'd like to take this on the road. It doesn't necessarily have to be a quilt, but we think that by putting together different images of neighborhoods, one can begin to learn many different stories and record, a particular person's point of view in that quilt by, using copper. If you look in this particular example, you see a lily pad, at the bottom, a battery, there's a speaker in here, and a kind of, I think there's a microcontroller. So essentially, the quilt becomes a way of networking with people and a way of connecting. So this is our way of taking something outside of the gallery and really looking at this place as a space that needed a conversation rather than trying to come in and put something onto the site without having any kind of conversation. This particular detail I really like. It shows a scene that speaks to how I set up my lab at Penn State. And the lab really is foregrounding a way of making the experiences that many of us had as kids and bringing that into an architectural space. Many of us had a lot of experience working with soft materials and wanting to bring that to architecture to make that available for students and others to really learn from. So these materials call for another way of fabrication and thinking about architecture that connects both to the scale of the body, because we often start by making things like clothing and then move up to large scales of architecture. So really a kind of sliding scale of thinking about architecture. And working this way returns you to the specifics of your body, not some abstract body that you're building for, like the Albertian man in the circle that we all know as architects, but a particular body that offers to the possibility of understanding a specific social and political construction in architecture. So this to me in this particular scene was very familiar, and wanted to really access this kind of well of knowledge and bring that to architecture. That interest was seated in my home, typically at our dining table in the summers with my mother, my sister, my aunt, who would be visiting from Chicago, who took a lot of fashion courses. So she taught us a lot about sewing and making things. This is also a way for my family to catch up. This is not my family. This picture actually here that you're looking at is by Teenie Harris, a Black photographer who worked for one of the first Black newspapers in the United States, the Pittsburgh Courier. So this is one of his pictures. And what he was trying to do is record Black life, just kind of everyday things that were happening in the neighborhood. So essentially what's happening here happened in my house. We didn't want for anything. We were not really struggling to get clothes, but we liked to make our own clothes because we could express our own identities that way. So that clothing and the making of elegance via how you carried yourself and what you wore was a way to transport you to somewhere else, to fight back, to take on other identities, understand the world in a different way, and most importantly, to dream. So this image is also by Teenie Harris, shows 1000 Wiley Avenue in the Hill District. And basically, this is right around 1961 when they were knocking down all the kind of buildings and making way for the Civic Center, which you can see here more fully as you pull out. You can see that here that all of the neighborhood in this case is gone. At the bottom, you see I-579 that crosses the Hill District, which was part of forming the national highway infrastructure laid across cities in the late 1950s and 60s. So for Pittsburghers now, the problem is really how to make infrastructure to connect across this divide to downtown. So in addition to this big sort of 28-acre asphalted area, that's this triangle, they're also trying to connect across this band of highways and connect it with downtown. So it separates the people that are commuting in and parking in these parking lots in the 28 acres with the kind of rest of the hill, which you see up the top of the slide and below to the cultural district. So at the time when it was constructed, the round dome was seen as a welcoming and gathering forum to collect people into the center of Pittsburgh. But as it went on, that was not the case. It really turned out to be this kind of no man's land. In the spaces that were knocked down were formed some very important places that are still there today if you go to Pittsburgh. This particular one where you see this poster was a gathering spot for people who were protesting what was happening in the neighborhood. This is across from a church that you see at the edge. And people would basically gather together, get their signs, correctly, put together, and basically march up and down the streets in the Hill District. So this site has a kind of real resonance and has actual kind of a mosaic, and there's some benches there today that commemorate some of these things that happen now. So I'd like to share with you a second triptych of videos on the Hill District that points to the disconnect underlying the recent greening of the city. They've done a lot of work in Pittsburgh, a lot of it focused on sustainability. But I'd like to point out here through this video some other things to think about.
Great.
So the reception part of the project at MoMA was what I call the black flower antenna. And it was located inside the museum. And it's a symbolic responsive structure, a receiving only antenna. 34 industrially knitted cones embedded with pink copper yarns transmit the presence of electromagnetic waves via high-pitched live sounds in the gallery. And in my head at the time, I was thinking really, what are ways that one could make visible and present the workings of an invisible urbanism that floats above the physical city, supported by and constructed by electromagnetic waves. We were working a lot on Zoom, where we were using the internet a lot, and that this itself was making this kind of whole other structure that I don't think we as architects were really paying attention to. So these invisible waves that support this are a new global ocean, making it possible for people to connect through the internet. However, traversing this ocean in our everyday practices is as perilous as the Atlantic of the Middle Passage. The black flower is a reminder of this other invisible space that is also being constructed and needs attention for a more life-valuing future. So the underbelly of the antenna shows pink copper embedded yarn, which is what permits the collection of these waves in the gallery. And the form of the flower was selected to allow us a gradient of parametrically sized cones that we could try out, looking at different algorithms which were used to fit and size the cones to get them to work so that we could predict essentially. These were drawn in Kangaroo and Kiwi 3D and simulated to see the exact size and shapes of what was going to come from this knit fabric. It was really important part of the project, and my PhD student, Farzana Alkazian, used this as the basis of her PhD dissertation. She's now teaching at Louisiana State, but really was to help us cut and size things all at once because we were up against a huge time deadline and needed to make sure that the project could be delivered at a certain size and scale. So we also tested a couple of different machine learning methods and used these in the end to produce the work that you see here. This has been published as a simulation process for architectural knitted textiles at IASS, and there are a couple other things that you can, a couple other publications about machine learning that Farzana has published on our website. One of the things that happened while we were making this was just its unpredictability. So while we were trying to make these algorithms to understand its size and final shape, you know, we were testing things and they were coming back huge, and we were stretching them on our kind of compression system and freaking out because they were never, you know, the stretching was endless. I still have pieces in my basement that are not finished stretching. And so really one of the things that we discovered during our kind of trial and error with this was adding copper and of course adding metal to the net to get it to be more predictable. And so that's where you see the pink copper yarn coming into it, and also the metal into it, helping the antenna. So these images that you see here are some of the process. It was quite iterative, used to make the antenna. drawing in the upper left quadrant, more traditional architectural drawing that was given. This was taken directly from Farzana's algorithm, because we had to figure out what size it needed to be small and then how big it would be stretched out. So this drawing was done. Then that was given to a industrial knitter, and that knitter plugged these patterns in stitch by stitch. So there was a little bit of translation that was happening there. Actually, Farzana is still working on this stitch by stitch translation, so that one could go from a drawing like this to the actual software in the knitting machine. Down here is the pieces as they emerged from the industrial knitting machine, a Shimaseki, and our compression system, and then filling in the compression system. And then far lower right-hand side is the antenna board, which was made for us by Erin Lewis, who at the time was a PhD student at the Swedish School of Textiles. So she had been working on looking at sort of electromagnetic textiles, and had made this board for us so that we could use it and connect it to our antenna, so that the antenna, as you approached it, made different noises in the gallery. This is Mabel looking at it, just to give you an idea of the scale of the piece. It was quite large. Some of these tubes were almost as tall as me on the kind of long axis of the diagonal of the oval. And then just to give you a sense of the sound it made, it's pretty raw. It's not music. And as people were able to walk underneath it, it changed the sound. But this project was put up by a computer. We did this all by Zoom. So the technicians at MoMA had all our pieces laid out. We had made videos for them to show them how to put together the piece. But at the end of the day, they were walking around with a computer, holding it up to things like that and asking us, all right, how do we do this? How do we do that? So in fact, no one actually got to play underneath it the way we had imagined. And so we're reinstalling this in the Penn State Museum. There's a new museum going up for the Palmer Museum, and that will be able to, people will be able to go underneath that and play and hear the different sounds. So it's a kind of rerun in allowing us to try that. So the last project that I'm going to share with you, you can see here in this image, there's tape on the ground where people were pretty much told to kind of stand back. So the whole listening, moving your body around part of it really changed in the gallery. And we hope to be able to get, a lot of people to get close to the piece. So the last project that I want to share with you is an example of a threshold overlapped digital and physical spaces, such as one might find at an airport or a card scanner getting into a building. Upon arriving to the airport in Venice to visit Italy, I was asked to step through a set of plexiglass doors into space that was bounded on the other side by plexiglass. And inside this space was a scanner and a screen with a face etched onto it to do a scan. One was asked to align one's eyes with the eyes of the face that was etched onto this kind of plexiglass. And then a scanner took the data of your face and matched it up with the information in your passport. So once it had located your passport picture and found that to be acceptable, you were let in to Italy. So there are more and more of these types of thresholds in the United States today. And really, I think as architects, we need to consider that. We need to understand that. So the project that Soft Lab did for the Venice Biennale starts to look at some of the crossings of this technology, with hair as a nexus in architecture. The gallery is an enmeshed digital and physical textile threshold that highlights the locking together of the physical and electromagnetic spatial boundaries. And it's about places that use biodata to permit or restrict access. So this overlapping is more and more happening. And really, we started with a word that talked a little bit about some of the feelings that people emotionally had about this. Started with the idea of dreadlock, which was a word of uncertain etymology. But for those who are English speaking, it's clear that these are two words making one: dread, fear, anxiety about the future, but also awe or reverence. And also the word lock, which is Old High German in origin, that refers to a curled or strand of a person's hair that curls together, or the property of matted hair, tangled beyond untangling, knotted forever. So in the exhibit, a visitor is invited to sit in the hairdresser's chair in the center of the space that faces a large screen. They're invited to push a button on the arm of the chair that then triggers a high-resolution webcam to take a photo of the back of their heads. This photograph is then cropped and further cropped to be compared to the photographs of hair in a database that we put together. The top 5 matches to the visitor's hair are presented on screen. No photos or no data are kept from the interaction. All the photos are destroyed after 120 seconds. And the screen closes with a thank you and lets visitors know that their data is destroyed. So the threshold uses a machine learning algorithm trained on a design database of global hair textures. And this database is called Figaro 1K. It's publicly available to any one of you, and is one of the few databases about hair that contains examples of African hair texture in hairstyles such as braids and dreadlocks. And I would say since its formation, there have been more coming online, but they created a database that showed hair textures in the wild where people were posed in many different positions. There are other hair databases that one can use. And these are normalized for frontal view and head sizes that are kind of perfectly positioned. So one could use those, but we wanted something that had poses in the wild. One of the other problems with making art, or kind of making this, is really that a lot of the photos that are part of the database are part of photographic collections and are private and are copyrighted photos, so they can't be used in a study like this. So the Figaro 1K was really useful and valuable. And really, this is where the design of the project started, with the careful design of this database, really trying to understand what questions we could ask it. Notably lacking in the database, and people asked me this a lot when I was in the exhibit in the Biennale, are photos of heads without hair or heads with a hat on, for example. That was not part of it. In these instances, if someone did sit down with a hat or a bald head, the machine learning algorithm gave random results. So if one were to base access to a physical space on these results, many people would not be able to enter. So the machine learning here was only trained on hair. On the far wall of the gallery space is a graphic showing some of the photos of hair types in the Figaro 1K database. And the classifications of this data set had 7 kinds of hair: straight, wavy, kinky, curly, braids, dreadlocks, and short. So the pictures that you see here are part of what we had on the wall. And this is actually taken from the kind of, I guess you could say, the kind of publication of that data set. and the pictures that we were using and how actually the process of using and making the machine learning worked. We used 980 pictures to train the program and 70 for checking for how well it learned. And before using the pictures, we made them ready by focusing on just the hair, cutting out unnecessary background. We took small pieces of hair pictures and made them a specific size. However, because hair comes in various shapes, the first cut sometimes wasn't great, including too much background. So we created a better method to cut the pictures. And really, we measured how far each pixel in the picture was from the hair's edge and chose the furthest pixel as the new center. So this helped us get cleaner or clearer pictures of the hair. So we then turned the color pictures back into black and white to help the program understand them. And the program itself is a series of pre-trained convolutional neural network classification backbones called ResNets that could tell different hairstyles apart. So there's some more technical things that happen, but essentially this is how our algorithm proceeded to work. It took in an image, we call it query image. It cropped a piece of the query image. It turned it black and white. It compared it to the cropped images in the database. And then it produced a result that had 3 different rows: positive, neutral, I should say, and negative. So positive is a good match. Neutral is kind of so-so, and the negative should be the opposite or not similar. On the other side in the exhibit of this kind of large screen with that's showing this kind of machine algorithm is a cabinet with small physical models and digital screens displaying examples of textiles, some of which are responsive and technologically connect to an electronic system. Others look at the concept of felting or dreadlocking with wool yarns. And these are actually going to be shown, many of these are going to be shown in the current Textile Design Now at the Center of Design in Montreal, opening on the 29th of November. But essentially what we were doing was looking for a technique to make fibers really strong, to take a lot of tension. So matting and dreadlocking was one way. And these are some of the models that we created. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, that were created using a knitting machine and a washing machine to get the kind of felting. So, experimenting with the diagrid, experimenting with a rectilinear system, experimenting with it in the round, trying to integrate a really kind of strong way of bringing forces down in a tube using a diagrid. So we were looking at Friato's his cooling towers, which had separated all the ways of bringing the kind of tension down into layers and thinking about how to knit that through this kind of strong integrated material. So I would like to conclude there. Essentially, what we are trying to do with all our different projects is make designs, tools, and event methods to look at textiles and understand how they allow us to make culture, how culture is made by these things, how culture is inflected by technology. And so with that, I'm going to close and take questions from the floor. Yeah.
Really intriguing how you are literally bringing together technology, history, and culture. And those things sometimes are tools to separate, right, the highways and store that's across the United States and American cities, as a tool to separate, um, uh, gentrify, certain areas as a sort of promise to project cities into the future. So how do you see this kind of work going forward, and other areas that you might be interested in now, about Pittsburgh and now after the NOAA, that are there other things that you're working on now?
Yes, we're really looking at working at a larger scale for one, and looking to develop some of these materials that we're thinking about. The models that I just showed you are very small scale, but they can be industrially produced to a larger scale. And so there are a number of trajectories, right? If one thinks about work as a kind of spider web, where there might be a kind of center, and then one has the opportunity to go out on different trajectories leading from the same work. One trajectory is looking at materiality and industrial design, and making new materials that also are culturally inflected, thinking in the back of your head, well, how is this also relating to thinking about how people imagine hair, how they've lived with hair. So that's one trajectory. Another trajectory is to really build methods to work with people to be in their communities and understand how they can improve their community, and things that they can do that are maybe simple, by having a conversation. So really starting a conversation. So that's another trajectory for this work. A third trajectory is really to test out some of these projects and buildings. We've developed a lot of tools that can, look at things structurally, and look at things that work for things that need to be tested at larger scale. So that's another trajectory. So really, there are way too many things to do in a lifetime, right? There's way too many things, but those are three that I've been thinking about right now. I don't know if that answers your question. Somewhat. Yes, gentlemen.
Software that we're developing, is it actually talking to some kind of a reading machine constructed? Or is it something that shape is generated and it still has to be in?
Yeah, so the process that I showed you, the way that I showed you the process is very compact, but we have a couple papers online that explain, for example, the software that I talked about in the lecture. That software that was developed by Farzana Aghazian is made to understand shape. So the way that we tested it was to make a drawing, put some measurements on the drawing, and then see if we could predict, right, by using a digital drawing, the final kind of real shape of the thing. So we knitted the piece using the sizes that we took from Farzana's digital model, and then tested it, pulled it, tensioned it, and tested it to see how close we could get. So the software that Farzana made does not necessarily produce the knitted piece. It produces measurements for a knitted piece using a particular material. So that means that there's still a gap in between. You can't just put in something in the software and then have it go seamlessly to the knitting machine. That's not happening. That would be the fantasy, but that's not happening. Yeah, there are some steps missing. Yeah. Yes. Oh.
So I'm curious if there's any specific coding techniques that y'all are studying in the final projects from different issues. And then maybe how you expand that, I'm understood.
Any knitting techniques?
Yeah.
The knitting techniques that we found were basically just taking something simple and playing with it on the knitting machine. So we were trying to start with making rolls of things like dreadlocks. We were trying to, understand how could you knit and capture the stitches so that you can make a solid roll that was really strong once you felted it. If you've ever made, I don't know if you've ever been a kid and made one of these knitted things that come out through a spool and then felted it, you get a really strong rope. So we were experimenting with that on the machine, but I liked your idea. We hadn't tried any patterns from other cultures. We were really looking at force lines, so to speak, like how they actually move through the material. Like how could we make certain areas of the material stronger so the forces would go there, and other areas thinner so that maybe you could have light, for example, or change the shape in it. But I like your idea of like culturally taking a pattern and then knitting it. Yeah. And a lot of cultures that we found in Africa used weaving more than knitting. We were working with knitting. So rather than looping the stitches, we're talking about a continuous loop. They were working with over and under in a warp direction and a weft direction. So it could be quite interesting to see what one could learn from structure and begin to think about structurally by weaving and thinking about African patterns or other cultural patterns. Many cultures have textile patterns, right, to use and think about. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so such beautiful, it's really fascinating and wonderful. It's not exactly a question, I guess, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what the textile, and just what the softness and the material means to you, and I guess both like from heat sense, but also I don't even know a lot of the like textiles also seem like cultural artifacts, practical artifacts, also political and all sorts of things in ways that just special.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I'm fascinated by textiles and architecture is simply that they are enmeshing, literally as a metaphor and literally as a thing, as stuff. They are shaped, they shape your brain. I think materials that we work with shapes our brain. And so when you work with something that's really tangled and complex, you're going to be working with something that's tangled and complex. You'll be thinking about, all right, how do all these things fit together? Maybe they don't exactly like align into one perfect story, but so I'm fascinated with that aspect of textiles, the kind of, I guess you could say, complexity of them. Culturally, I love that almost every culture on the planet has its textile way of making and its materials that root it to a place. So for example, when we use wool, we can talk about sheep in Pennsylvania, right? I'm coming from Pennsylvania. We can talk about a locus here, perhaps in New Mexico. There are other fibers that one might use to begin to think about making textiles here. So they root you into a place, and I really appreciate that about thinking about architecture, because I think so much of the things that we make don't consider material. So when I use textiles, that brings it home to literally where your body is. I also appreciate, just to answer your question, the kind of sensuousness of it. In other words, it's a tactile thing that you're giving credence to and understanding that as an important feedback in the intelligence that you're getting from the material, like how it feels, how it's operating as you're manipulating the material, and thinking about the material. So all these things, they relate through a kind of enmeshing of considering literally just this one type of processing of it. And in terms of softness, I would say that what we've been trying to do is think about those qualities of textiles and how, for example, it does mean that your body is important when you're working with this material, where it is, how you're tensioning something, how you're working with something to even get a prototype, right? How you're sort of playing on a machine, and to kind of allow the body to be there, to allow someone's specific story to be there, to allow someone specific, like being in a particular place, to be present. And so I think that is how the softness, at least how I've been thinking about it in our lab, has been important. So really allowing students and for us to think about positionality, think about where you are, what you're doing, where the material came from, like all these interconnected things in a way that's fairly straightforward and basic. So I could go on about it, but there's a start. Yes.
Yeah, I have,
Robert.
so I was fortunate enough to see not too long ago at ANPA, their book collection. You have the largest collection of African American books. And the Folk Art Museum in New York, and that also had some of those books. I think that's been very much, sit in the world of outside art. And I'm curious, you mentioned at one point in your talk, you were saying that you are now also exploring recycled materials, materials that don't, that maybe, pay attention to this. And I'm curious to see how that, I mean, there's sort of a preciousness in this work, and that sort of the high technology requires that, because you're coordinating software technology with fabrication. Where would your work go, or how do you explore it materials that
Yeah, I would say more recently our lab has been looking into using like things that are leftover waste materials, but we have not taken the deep dive on that yet. And I would say that is a potentially next thing that a student could work on, like in my lab, is really understanding the circularity of some of these materials, what happens to them. I have an artist friend that has been working in the Atacama Desert, and she was stunned. She has pictures of all these textiles that are just dumped there in the desert, and nothing happens to them. They don't biodegrade, nothing happens. So I think that is definitely a next location for figuring out what happens with these textiles. But in terms of the preciousness of technology, I don't think it has to be precious. I think that's another thing to try, to figure out how can we use more things that are easily available to people. And the more familiar that I get with this way of working, the more comfortable I feel with doing that, and the more I understand how it can be done, because I can see the kind of context around. So it took a little bit of being in it to then understand, okay, this is how it needs to also change. Yeah, but thank you for that question.
One reason why I had that was great, was bounce down to Sarah, who is in the darkness. She's
Sarah, oh, sorry.
Sorry, that's a great question.
Yeah. Sarah, hi.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. And so I was especially thinking about your mode of contribution, and just bringing it visible, not to be there. The visible evidence is the of the ground. And then it made me think about what happens when we diving into the oceans to find the physical infrastructure for those. And I think in both cases, obviously, with both cases, you made comprehensive to completely incomprehensible. Previously, one about the name of Pittsburgh, and cancer and internet, and both of them so logically about the concept of spatial controls of the position. I think with, the difference, and the other question is that with happening, these models and using something that's so familiar and relatable and achieve.
Yeah.
That's something that is so enormous, if you're not going to do it. The majority obviously on more abstract material where the problem that's transmitting sound of the limited
Mhm.
so I'm curious about how we really translate that specific concept to your audience and how it is actually received and what responses.
Yes, I think that in the MoMA setup, the sound was actually in a threshold, literally like as one walked into the gallery. So people heard these sounds. And then after reading a little sign, they understood that the sound was coming from underneath the antenna and other people moving around it. So they could not necessarily hear their own sounds as they moved around the antenna. The second installation, we would like to have it be more direct so people can understand that when they move their bodies, this noise or this pitch will change. And they can see a kind of relationship between the piece and what they're doing. So that's another installation that we will have. But in terms of what you're talking about, the invisible internet, the craziness of how much stuff is not seen by our gigantic infrastructure, I think that is a huge problem, and it is shaping architecture. And because we don't see it, we forget about it, and we don't think about it. Nevertheless, it really impacts and shapes our daily life. It impacts what we can do. It impacts, where we can be at what times, and it impacts us politically, who can go in certain spaces, who cannot. And I think it's going to get more and more like this. There are people that are fighting, for example, just kind of, for example, Joy Buolomi at MIT Media Lab was looking at facial recognition systems. Simply making policies for whose faces, whose faces are included, who are not, is step one. But then do you want your face to be included? Probably not, potentially not. And so I think there are all these other, there are all these policies that need to be made on the fly that are happening now that are going to affect or are affecting architecture. And I'm really interested in that. It's tough though, because it's not material. So in one way, a textile can be a kind of proxy, as it were, for this kind of enmeshing stuff that's really invisible, that we can't see, that we don't know about. Yeah, that's your question.
This actually sounds like a question.
Yeah.
I think the community. I guess another question I have in mind is, when you ask, you said, I could talk about this issue of necessarily violence with people from, I also have, especially when you know about it, living with the conversation. I guess, when it comes to having your ability or maybe it's a reason or how effective do you find that to be a significant difference in readability or conversation and then they're usually immaterial elements?
Yeah, definitely. I think one has to be open to, when one's conversing with people, to understanding, well, maybe some people don't want to work on a quilt because they're afraid of working with soft materials. They're not used to it. They're going to freak out. The stuff is going to stick all over their hair. You have to be open to that and allow people to participate as they were, or do something else as well, right? That comes from a place where you are with them. So the quilt really is a conversation starter to talk about people's neighborhoods, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that material. One can, with careful listening, hear what might be appropriate materials for that particular group of people, and every group is different. So it can be a conversation starter. And sometimes, you know, I've had workshops where people have really gotten into, they've really enjoyed working with the materials. And other times people are sort of not sure what to do, alienated and like not sure. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.